The 3rd of April, 1945. Aschaffenburg, Germany. Dawn did not rise over the city so much as seep into it, thin and gray through smoke, over broken church stone and palace walls split open by shell fire. The streets were wet with the cold residue of a spring night, and littered with roof tile, plaster, spent brass, and the splintered frames of windows that no longer looked out on anything except ruin. Somewhere in that ruin a rifle still cracked, small and sharp against the heavier silence that follows bombardment. On a young American infantryman crouched behind a jeep seat, there was mud on the cuffs, soot on the cheek, and in the breast pocket of his field jacket, wrapped in paper gone soft from sweat and rain, a square of army chocolate. The white flags had begun to appear by then, but in late war Germany, white flags did not always mean silence. They fluttered from damaged masonry, from cellars where civilians prayed the killing would pass them by, from towers where local authority had already accepted what Berlin refused to speak aloud. Yet from other windows and barricaded barracks, from tunnel-linked houses and shattered corners of the old city, men still fired. This was the last fever of the Reich in the West. Surrender in one street, fanaticism in the next, a hand raised for mercy, while 50 yards away, another clung to an oath that had already buried Europe. That morning mattered, because it belonged to the final argument between two systems. By March 1945, the Western Allies had broken through the old winter barriers, reached the Rhine, and begun crossing into the German heartland. Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on March 22, catching German troops off guard, and within 48 hours 4 American divisions had crossed there. Operation Undertone, the combined drive of the 3rd and 7th Armies through the Rhineland, pushed powerful Allied forces into central and southern Germany, and helped destroy the last coherent German defenses west of the river. The war in the West was no longer about whether Germany would lose. It was about how much of Germany would be shattered before its soldiers admitted it. To German professionals, Patton already had a reputation that was larger than rumor. General Günther Blumentritt later said the Germans regarded him extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a commander whose speed and violence of maneuver came closest to their own. Tradition of war. Heinz Guderian, the apostle of armored warfare, said he had heard much about Patton and congratulated him on his campaign, adding that Patton had acted as he himself would have done. This is what made the final weeks so bitter. The Germans did not think they were collapsing before fools. They believed they were facing an enemy who had mastered movement, timing, and shock, and who possessed resources the Reich could no longer match. But ideology dies harder than armies. For years, Nazi propaganda had taught German soldiers to think of the Americans as rich, soft, comfort-loving, overfed, politically divided, a nation of jazz, cigarettes, canned food, and weak nerves. The Americans had refrigerators, chewing gum, endless trucks, good boots, and chocolate bars. That was supposed to mean decadence. That was supposed to mean fragility. In the minds of many German boys and convalescents dragged back into uniform in 1945, abundance still looked like weakness. They believed that a people accustomed to plenty would fear rubble. They believed that if a town became ugly enough, if enough snipers held on in enough attic windows, if enough shells burst in enough crossroads, the Americans would hesitate. They would negotiate. They would slow down. They would want to save lives more than win streets. What they encountered instead was one of the central truths of the war. American abundance was not softness. It was power, arranged in democratic form. It was rail cars, ration depots, artillery parks, bridge engineers, truck convoys, replacement pools, fuel dumps, aircraft maintenance crews, and food, packed in precise measured units for men spread across continents. Patton's Third Army alone fielded more than 320,000 men during Operation Undertone. American formations had become highly proficient at combining infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into a single crushing system. Even the small object in a rifleman's pocket spoke of that system. Hershey products were part of multiple wartime ration packs, and the Army Field Ration K included a chocolate bar as its dessert component. By war's end, Hershey had produced millions upon millions of ration items for the armed forces. The square of chocolate in a soldier's pocket was a trivial thing, until one remembered that it had crossed an ocean to be there, and that whole nations fail when they can no longer do even small things reliably. Aschaffenburg stood directly in the path of this reality. A city of roughly 38,000 on the Main River, 40 miles from Frankfurt, it was not Berlin, not Cologne, not one of the great names of the war, but geography had given it importance. The Main curved around it. Roads and rail converged there. The town sat in broken terrain, with wooded foothills and defensible approaches, and above its streets rose the old Stiftskirche and the heavy mass of Schloss Johannesburg, buildings that lent height, observation, and stone strength to a defense that had no business lasting as long as it did. On Palm Sunday, March 25, the leading elements of Colonel Creighton Abrams's Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division reached the city. They came fast, because Patton's army had trained itself to make speed a weapon, and speed that week often meant arriving before bridges could be blown. At Aschaffenburg, they missed by seconds. American tanks rushed the main road bridge, came under intense fire, and the lead Sherman was hit repeatedly by anti-tank rounds, Panzerfausts, and mortars. It exploded, and then the Germans demolished the bridge beneath it, dropping span and tank into the river. Yet just south of that failure, American scouts found a railroad bridge still standing. In a matter of minutes, they charged across, shoved aerial bombs into the water, cut wires, and opened a bridgehead on the far bank. Within half an hour of being sighted, Americans were already across the Main and climbing the hills south of the city. That speed should have doomed the defense. In earlier months of the war, towns had fallen after such strokes, almost mechanically. But Aschaffenburg was one of those places where the collapse of Germany did not proceed in a straight line. The garrison there, under Major Emil Lamberth, was a patchwork of late-war desperation. Replacement troops, officer candidates, convalescents from hospitals, engineers, artillerymen, a small SS contingent, and companies of Volkssturm militia. Hitler had designated the place a fortress. Lamberth swore to defend it, and by the time the battle reached full intensity, the defenders numbered roughly 8,500 men. There were not enough tanks, not enough artillery, and not enough fuel in Germany anymore to make such fortresses truly strong. What they had instead was fanaticism, local knowledge, stone buildings, and the freedom to sacrifice a city already claimed by a dead ideology. This is where the emotional divide widened. Many German soldiers in 1945 no longer expected victory, but they still expected something from resistance. Some hoped an obstinate defense would buy time for civilians to flee east. Some believed that if they bled the Americans badly enough in towns like this one, the Western powers might split from the Soviets or negotiate a different peace. Others, especially younger men marinated in propaganda, still thought the Americans would prove less hard than the Russians, more cautious, more vulnerable to nerves. If a German unit gave the appearance of yielding and then resumed fire, or if a few strongpoints held out after the formal command structure had already cracked, there was still the fantasy that confusion itself could be a weapon. A wavering white cloth, a pause in shelling, a shift in the line that might be enough to prolong the impossible. The Americans who entered the fight did not arrive expecting a medieval siege. The 45th Infantry Division, ordered into the sector after the initial armored seizure of the bridgehead, had been told the town had already been cleared. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, whose battalion would help take the city, later remembered that the resistance in the Aschaffenburg area came as a great surprise to my regiment and division. Another veteran would say that aside from the hills near Casino, nowhere had the Germans handed it to us like this. When Sparks looked through binoculars toward Schweinheim and Aschaffenburg, he saw empty streets and, significantly, no white flags or bedsheets hanging from the windows. The town was not preparing to yield. It was preparing to fight, block by block. And so the battle took on the shape of old stone and modern firepower. German officer candidates and defenders turned houses into strongpoints. Some were linked by underground passages, allowing positions already cleared to be reoccupied from below. Snipers slipped back into American rear areas. Mortars chopped up roads and open approaches. Panzerfaust teams waited in side streets for tanks to nose too close. The 45th Division answered the way veteran American formations had learned to answer by 1945. With combined arms so intimate, it became almost mechanical. Artillery battered designated strongpoints. Sherman tanks and tank destroyers rolled up and fired directly into walls and windows. Infantry stormed the buildings, while the defenders inside were pinned or concussed. When resistance returned from the same block again, more steel came. It is easy to miss, in such fighting, the small human objects that survive inside memory. A field dressing packet, a rosary, a photograph folded inside a paybook, or that chocolate bar still in its paper. One can imagine an American private kneeling in a shell hole on the edge of Schweinheim before first light, breaking off one corner with dirty fingers because coffee was gone cold and breakfast was whatever lived in his pockets. To him it was only sugar, fat, familiarity, a taste of something that had not come from mud or cordite. But to the Germans, watching this enemy come on day after day, that same object meant something larger. It meant the other side could feed boys at the edge of battle better than Germany could feed whole districts of civilians behind the lines. It meant the American Republic could make war without ceasing to make comfort. It meant factories were still running, ships were still sailing, and the machinery behind the man in the foxhole was vaster than the ruined town in front of him. As the struggle deepened, civilians became trapped inside the moral wreckage of the Nazi state. The city leadership had ordered the elderly, women, and children out, declaring that those who stayed would be expected to help in the defense. Some civilians carried supplies or tended wounded because there was no other choice. Others hid in basements and listened to buildings collapse around them. During the battle, Major Lamberth ordered an officer, Lieutenant Heyman, hanged after he was accused of desertion. His body was left on a lamppost with a sign marking him a coward. It was the purest image of the regime in its final weeks. A government that could no longer protect its own towns but still knew how to punish surrender. On March 29, the Germans launched a serious counterattack around the bridgehead. It penetrated parts of the American perimeter in darkness and early morning, but the answer came quickly. Counterattacks supported by tanks and artillery drove the attackers back by noon. That same day and the day after, more American artillery poured in. 4 battalions from the 44th Division were attached. 5 corps-level battalions, some with 8-inch howitzers, joined the pounding. P-47 Thunderbolts came overhead with rockets, bombs, machine gun fire, and even napalm. Mortars fired white phosphorus. Self-propelled guns were brought up for direct support. German frogmen sent to destroy the railroad bridge were killed. Every hour reinforced the same lesson. If the defenders believed stubbornness itself could wear the Americans down, they had misunderstood the material basis of the war. Resistance no longer reduced American force. Resistance summoned more of it. This was the point at which expectation and experience finally broke apart. The Germans had expected that urban resistance might restore a measure of control to their dying side. That is what cities had done in older wars. Streets canceled cavalry. Rubble broke formation. Narrow lanes made artillery less decisive. But the American way of war in 1945 had absorbed the city into its method. If houses were linked by tunnels, the block was shelled. If snipers reappeared behind cleared positions, tanks returned and fired point blank. If a barracks held, self-propelled 155s were dragged into line-of-sight positions and blasted its masonry until room-to-room fighting could begin again. At Aschaffenburg, the old urban promise that the weak defender might equalize the strong attacker inside a city failed because the attacker was not merely brave or numerous, he was industrial. At noon on March 31, the commander of the 157th Infantry dispatched Captain Ansei Spears in an L-19 aircraft to drop a surrender ultimatum over the city. The note told the Germans their situation was hopeless and that American superiority in men and material was overwhelming. It offered unconditional surrender to save lives and civilian property. Another version of the message ended ominously. The fate of Aschaffenburg is in your hands. This was not rhetoric for its own sake. It was a statement of arithmetic. The defenders could still choose the duration of the battle, but not its outcome. Lamberth ignored the warning. Easter Sunday came without peace. The American ring tightened around the city as surrounding towns fell and the envelopment was completed. Barracks in the southern sector became slaughterhouses of close combat. One strong point was reduced only after tanks fired white phosphorus into it, and infantry stormed through the smoke. Another required 2 M12, self-propelled 155mm howitzers to fire more than 100 rounds directly into the structure while infantry fought for half the building. The defenders inside were not cowards. They were trapped men, some wounded already, some too young, some too conditioned to disobey. But courage in the service of a dead cause only made the rubble deeper. Somewhere in those same hours, perhaps in a cellar or an aid station improvised behind a wall that no longer had a roof, the contrast would have become painfully intimate. A German wounded man, hungry, dirty, stunned by concussion and dust, might have watched an American medic unwrap bandages manufactured in abundance, iodine bottled in abundance, sulfa packed in abundance, and perhaps seen a bit of ration chocolate passed along with water. The symbolism is not sentimental, it is brutal. A democracy had arrived with enough surplus to spare calories for mercy, while still fielding the shells that had smashed the ward above his head. German propaganda had taught him that America was shallow because it was rich. Yet the thing lying in that American pocket, small, sweet, mass-produced, was bound to more artillery tubes, more medical trucks, more bridging equipment, more spare parts, more fuel. and more replacement manpower than the Reich could dream of assembling in its last spring. By April 2, the city administrators were hanging white and Red Cross flags on their cellar to mark non-combatant status, but the battle still had not ended. More than 1,100 Germans surrendered that day. Yet the remaining defenders clustered around the Schloss and isolated strongpoints continued to resist as airstrikes and artillery battered what was left of the city. This was the grotesque duality of late Nazi Germany. Official surrender in fragments, military resistance in fragments, each fragment detached from any wider strategy except the reflex to continue. Then came the morning that answers the title, though not in the melodramatic way later retellings prefer, at 7 a.m. On April 3, Major Lamberth sent a Volkssturm officer and a captured American to seek terms. Colonel O'Brien refused negotiation. He demanded surrender by 8 a.m., or the fighting would continue. Even then, as preparations for artillery, tanks, and aircraft went on, there were still German strongpoints left in the city. In other words, surrender was beginning, but the shooting had not truly stopped. That was the reality at the end of the war. Not a single clean gesture, but a chain of collapses, some honest, some delayed, some half accepted, while other men still clung to walls and rifles. When Sparks reached the Schloss, he later remembered telling Lamberth, "I'm a colonel, and now I want you to surrender." The German major gave an order, and his officers came out single file, removed their pistol belts, and dropped them at Sparks's feet. Yet even then, the work was not finished. Sparks knew that some positions were still holding out, so he put Lamberth in the jeep and drove him around the city. The German commander had to go to the remaining strongpoints and order them to surrender as well. That was how the battle ended, not with a grand handshake, not with a speech, but with the defeated being made to walk back through the fragments of their own resistance and extinguish them one by one. And that, in the most historically honest sense, is what Patton's War did when Germans fired after surrender had already begun. It did not indulge drama. It did not freeze in confusion. It did not offer endless renegotiation to fanatics who wished to hide behind white cloth and keep shooting from cellar mouths. The American answer, in Patton's operational world, and in the wider Allied method by spring 1945, was simple. Lawful surrender would be accepted. Continued resistance would be crushed with overwhelming force, and any surviving enemy command would be used to shut down its own remaining pockets if possible. Mercy and violence were not opposites here. They were sequential. The law was offered first. Steel followed if the law was mocked. To German soldiers, this could be more shocking than slaughter alone. They had been raised in a state that confused theatrical hardness with actual strength. It hanged its own officers to prove resolve. It commanded fortress cities to die for symbols. It told boys in hospital convalescents that loyalty mattered more than outcome. But on the receiving end of the American advance, many Germans discovered a different kind of hardness: cold, procedural, immensely supplied, and capable of honoring the Geneva Convention while still leveling a barracks. The Americans offered surrender terms. They used interpreters. They took prisoners by the thousand. They processed the wounded. And when the firing resumed, they answered not with panic, but with a radio call, a fire mission, an airstrike, another bridge, another column, another battalion already on the move. There was ideological transformation in that. Not always noble, not always spoken, and not always immediate. Some German prisoners still hated the Americans. Some still feared Soviet captivity more. Some still clung to fantasies of betrayal and miracle weapons. But many saw plainly enough that the regime had lied about what democracy looked like under strain. Democracy did not mean softness. It meant that a nation of clerks, farmers, factory workers, mechanics, immigrant families, school teachers, labor organizers, and small-town storekeepers had built a war machine broad enough to carry law inside force. Even in frontline rations, there was a reminder of home, a reminder that the state they served had not reduced life to pure starvation and command. The chocolate bar in an American pocket was not merely food. It was the taste of a society whose abundance came from participation rather than plunder. From the German side, the recognition could be humiliating. The Reich had promised heroism and delivered hanging posts, teenage militia, and hospital patients with rifles. It had promised national unity and produced a city where civilians hid under white cloth while party discipline demanded death upstairs. It had promised that enemies driven by comfort would never outlast believers driven by sacrifice. Yet by April 1945, the believers were malnourished, undersupplied, fuel-starved, and increasingly commanded by men who could only ask for more sacrifice because they had nothing else left to distribute. The Americans, by contrast, distributed shells, fuel, cigarettes, morphine, gasoline, bridging timbers, replacement tracks, fresh socks, and yes, chocolate. One system offered death in the name of purity. The other offered material sufficiency and then turned that sufficiency because wars are not decided only by the size of guns or the genius of generals. They are decided by what whole societies can place, day after day, in the pockets of ordinary men. Germany, in its last spring, could place a rifle in the hands of a convalescent and a rope around the neck of an officer who had lost faith. America could place, in the same hour, a demolition team at a bridge, a fuel convoy on a road, a medical kit in a jeep, a radio battery in a pack, and a ration sweet enough to remind a homesick infantryman of a country still alive behind him. That is why the symbolic object matters. The chocolate bar was not decadent. It was condensed civilization. It was factory labor, shipping space, agricultural surplus, packaging, payroll, standardization, and the quiet assumption that a soldier was a citizen worth feeding, not merely a body worth spending. In the ruins of Germany, that mattered as much psychologically as artillery. A regime built on scarcity, fear, and coercion was being beaten by one that could still afford procedure, still afford mercy, still afford calories, still afford to think beyond the next shell. The Germans who survived these final battles did not merely encounter American firepower. They encountered American plenitude and understood at last that freedom and abundance were not signs of weakness. They were the reserve from which endurance comes. So when people ask what Patton did when German soldiers fired after surrendering, the deepest answer is not found in a single shouted order or a single dramatic gesture. It lies in the system he represented at the edge of victory. He kept moving. He kept pressure on. He accepted surrender when it was real. He crushed resistance when it was not. And behind all of it stood a republic rich enough to be relentless and lawful at once. In the end, that is the larger truth left behind in places like Aschaffenburg. Dictatorships often look strongest at the moment they begin to starve, because they can still command sacrifice after they have lost the ability to provide life. Free city into combat power. The larger campaign confirmed the lesson. Operation Undertone cost the Third Army more than 5,000 casualties, including hundreds killed, but it cleared nearly 5,000 square miles of German territory and helped kill or capture more than 100,000 German soldiers. Third Army and Seventh Army forces were soon deep in Germany. The Wehrmacht still fought in places, but increasingly it fought like a body after the mind has gone violent reflexes, spasms of coherence, brief local stubbornness without strategic future. Even among German military observers, the perception shifted. Patton was not simply the loud American of legend. He became, in memory, the embodiment of an American style that had fused aggression to resources. The same men who had once thought the United States too commercial, too comfortable, too heterogeneous to endure continental war, found themselves studying an enemy who drove fast, improvised fast, crossed rivers fast, and fed his armies while doing it. Blumentritt's admiration and Guderian's respect were not compliments paid to a myth. They were acknowledgments that by 1945, the Americans had turned abundance into maneuver, and maneuver into decision. Aschaffenburg itself paid the price of refusing that decision. By the end of the battle, roughly 70% of the city had been destroyed. German casualties were estimated in the thousands, about 1,600 killed or wounded, and some 3,500 taken prisoner in one widely cited account. American losses were far lower, though still bloody, around 20 killed and roughly 300 wounded. That ratio tells its own grim truth. Fanatical defense did not save the place. It magnified the ruin and concentrated it on those too trapped or too indoctrinated to end it sooner. And so let the camera return to that dawn street, to the wet stones and the last shots fading among shattered walls. Let it linger on the small square of chocolate in the American soldier's pocket. Societies often look frivolous from a distance, because their strength is hidden in ordinary things, in packaged food, spare parts, bridge sections, mail from home, elected governments, arguing while factories run, and a square of chocolate surviving in a soldier's pocket through smoke and rain. But when history asks which system can carry men farther, feed them longer, replace them faster, and still leave room for mercy inside victory, the answer is written not only in the ruins of the enemy city, but in the sweetness that remained, uncrushed, in the victor's hand.